Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. This is the podcast where we offer up casual conversations that provide important insights on U.S. policy in the Middle East. I'm Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow here at the Middle East Institute and the host of the podcast here. And I'm really lucky today to have former U.S. official and co-author of a terrific new book, Tomorrow is Yesterday, Rob Malley. Rob, welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East.
Thank you.
Edge off the Middle East. Great to be here. Have you here. Sorry. Your book is beautiful. The writing, you've done something amazing that I think in the think tank community is rare, which is a very readable book. It's enjoyable, even if you don't know the subject. I think someone who would approach Israel and Palestine for the first time would find this very accessible. So you and Hussein Aga, your co-author, has done something very, very wonderful here. And it's an honest, I think, thoughtful.
I think we should end the podcast right here.
But somewhat, you basically have had a front row seat for U.S. Foreign policy making in Democratic administrations over the last 20 years. And I want to highlight the word honest because you're quite candid about where you fell short. Tell us first what motivated you to write this book and why the title, Tomorrow is Yesterday.
Yeah, so thanks. And it's great to be with you. And I'm sure we'll talk about how we first met a quarter of a century ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a book born a little bit of anger, a little bit out of frustration, and a little bit out of hope, I guess. So I think part of the anger was after October 7th, and both the massacre of October 7th and then the slaughter that followed. We were reading all these things that made it sound as if what Hamas had done had no context and no relationship to any prior acts that the Palestinians had undertaken, and that Israel's response was just the handiwork of Netanyahu and his most extreme right-wing members of his Gvir and Smotrich, members of his cabinet, and that just seemed to us to be so off. In fact, we think, as we write, that what October 7th is Palestine through and through. There's a history of Palestinians resorting to acts of violence, including against civilians, throughout, since 1948. And Israel's response was not just Bibi; it was welcomed and applauded by the vast majority of Israelis, and it's not that different from what Israel has wanted to do to the Palestinians for a long time. So that was the first reaction: was this is completely misdiagnosed and mischaracterized. So that's kind of the anger. The frustration, which was sort of as that happened, as Hussein and I have been discussing now for a quarter of a century since I first met him, is how could we be so far off the objective that the greatest superpower in the world had assigned and had decreed, and that the whole world applauded two-state solution. 30 years later, we're farther from it than ever before. That's the second dimension. We felt we need to explain and understand it, and Hussein really wanted to understand what the hell the U.S. has been doing all this time. And the hope was to see, can we, out of all this, think of a way to build from the debris? That may be the hardest part.
Yeah.
And we called it Tomorrow's Yesterday to be very quick, is because in so many ways, again, what's happening now is not novel. It's not an aberration. It's not a rupture from the past. It's a reenactment of the past, of the ways Israelis and Palestinians have behaved towards one another, and the way the United States has behaved. I mean, throughout the Biden administration was very reminiscent in a microcosm and in a more intensified and exacerbated way of the way the U.S. behaved for many, many, many decades past, which is condemn with one side of their mouth, enable with the other.
So it's sort of this Groundhog Day quality. That's where the title comes from. The repeat coming from the movie back 20, 30 years ago.
But also the notion that we are where the Israelis and Palestinians were decades and decades ago, after 1948, with the Palestinians adrift without a leadership, Israel dominant but isolated at the same time, and Israelis and Palestinians having absolutely no common view of where the future will go. So in so many ways, so much of what we're seeing today, for those who have followed this for decades past, is reminiscent of the core nature of the struggle since 1948. You call it Groundhog Day or simply Tomorrow's Yesterday, because where we are and where we're headed is very much where we've been in the past.
Yeah, so Tomorrow's Yesterday. This is almost a cadence, a lyric that you use in the penultimate chapter called Yesterday. And again, this is to the writing, and you don't find this often because I don't know about you. You worked at Crisis Group and CFR and other think tanks, and just a criticism of our industry is we don't know how to write.
Well, we write in a different way, and I think it's part of what inspired the book is we're tired of these policy reports, policy prescriptions, which I wrote my fair share of, and they're still useful.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they speak to a small number of people who sometimes may agree with the recommendations, but can't implement them, can't do anything about them. And so we wanted to write something different that, as you say, would appeal to a broader audience and touch them in a way maybe that a policy report wouldn't.
Yeah.
And a policy report today that says what Israelis and Palestinians should do would be so detached from reality because, frankly, at this point, there is very little that can be done other than rethink the errors of the past.
Yeah, and I think I read the book also as part of a genre of books that have emerged. Some of your former colleagues and friends, like Phil Gordon, Stephen Simon, Mark Lynch, who never served, but academics who are quite critical of the U.S. approach on all of this, and not just Israel-Palestine. What I think is interesting about your book, and I hope this conversation will prompt you to write a second book, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Iran, Yemen, Syria. On the edges of a book that's mostly about Palestine and Israel, you offer some really interesting insights, which I'm going to ask you about the policymaking under Obama and under Biden as well. But I have to tell you, it also leaves me wondering, okay, then what? What's next? Because you've gotten this in a lot of the interviews you've done in the book. You sort of gravitate, you and Hussein, your co-author, towards an equal rights-based approach on Palestine and Israel. But you also offer up a number of different options in your final chapter as well. I don't want to get to that just yet, but where are you right now? Especially, we're not going to talk that much about Trump 2.0. I don't think policy formulation is sort of linear.
Their forte.
Yeah, and their forte and things like this. But on that rights-based approach, you seem to allude and you make clearly that may be more practical and more pragmatic than sticking with the two-state solution. I don't see it. I'm not convinced at the end of your book, and I can tell you why. But give us your.
So I mean, again, and you make a fair point. I don't think that we certainly don't favor one model over another. In fact, as you know, we say the most likely is probably perpetuation and worsening of the status quo. We say that's the most likely outcome. As everyone who says the status quo is unsustainable is forgetting the fact that nothing has been more sustainable than the status quo. Right. It's what we've lived with now for over 30 years. So I don't think that we're saying that an equal rights based approach is going to occur. What we're saying is, it really is telling people, stop repeating the same dogma, the same tired phrases, like parrots just saying two-state solution, inevitable. What is it? What is a new expression? It's a irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state.
Right.
And they say it, and they don't have any clue how to get there. They don't really believe it themselves. All they have is the evidence of the last 30 years under far more favorable conditions that failed. Now, what are the alternatives? Frankly, I don't know. The ideas of confederation, of federation. Some have a federation with Jordan. Others say confederation between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah.
Some looser definition of sovereignty. I think where we really want to break from is this notion of a rigid ethno-national definition of statehood with a hard partition, which we don't see happening. What are you going to do with hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers?
Right.
What are you going to do about the refugee problem, which has never even been addressed in a serious way? There's going to be, I think we're going to have to think of more creative forms of sharing sovereignty, of break down the rigid categories of the past. You asked me, do I know if it's going to happen, how it's going to happen? No, but rather than keep our head buried in the sand and saying two states, and in 30 years from now, we'll be further away from it than we are today,
Right.
Let's take the time. Something's not going to happen tomorrow anyway. So what's wrong with having Israelis and Palestinians and others open themselves up to different ways of thinking that are more likely to address the deep aspirations and fears of both sides.
So your book is really not a literal policy prescription. It's a wake up call
It's
to
an
say,
anti-policy
prescription. It's that's how I read it.
Yeah.
The one question is, I was reading through it, and what scares the hell out of me after October 7th and for 2.5 years is this dehumanization that I think has happened in our dialogue, in the Israeli dialogue, but also Palestinians. You know, I lived and worked on the Palestinian territories in the West Bank of Gaza in the 1990s. And it just scares the hell out of me that if you have this process of dehumanization, like all of these concepts, whether it's two-state or confederation or things like this, it implies that there's a basic recognition of the humanity of the other side that actually I worry is not even present at this time to even have the sorts of dialogues that you detail in the book that you and Hussein were part of. Back channels, front channels, and things like this, that we do need some sort of cooling off period where people can see each other as people. I don't know if you...
Yeah. So first I'd say, and again, it was part of the impetus for the book, if you could so quickly fall into October 7th with the majority of Palestinians, whether the polls say it or not, I think it's sort of hard to deny that most Palestinians at a time felt a moment of pride.
Yeah.
You know, and you know the Palestinians. I'm not saying that this is what they wanted to do to Israelis, but when they saw it, part of them felt finally somebody has made the Israelis pay the price of what they've made us endure for the last several decades. So when you have that on the one side and wall-to-wall support on the Israeli side for what, as you know, legal scholars are now calling a genocide. You know, so when you have both those, it tells you that there was never a period where they viewed each other sort of as fully normal, equal human beings deserving of equal treatment.
Sure.
That was never broken, that you had underneath the essence, the core of the conflict had never been broken.
Yeah.
I don't believe in existential hatreds that Jews and Palestinians and Muslims are designed or destined to hate one another, but nothing that happened over the last 30 years has attenuated those mutual fears and the hatred and dehumanization. So yeah, something's going to have to happen if they're going to be prepared to coexist. Again, one thing that I would say to those who, and when I speak to Israelis, they say, well, it has to start in the school, in the classroom. Palestinians have to learn about Israelis, and sometimes you could say the same about Israelis. Yes, no classroom is more effective than the life experience.
Right.
And if you take the Palestinians, and again, you saw it, your one experience at a checkpoint will erase whatever hundreds of hours you may learn in the classroom.
Yeah.
So you could try to build trust and humanize each side, but that's going to be as much a product of them living to coexisting peacefully than the other way.
You've got to
around.
experience each other. And one of the products, I lived out there from 1996 to 98, and one of the products of Oslo was actually more checkpoints, more distance, and this was before the second Intifada.
Yeah.
Speaking of humanizing, I'm wearing a goofy jacket for the holiday.
Humanizes you quite a bit.
Very human, but it's also very hot in here.
Okay.
This is our last episode before the holiday season, so that's why I was wearing it, but I'm going to take it off. This book has been out, Rob, for a couple of months. When did it come out?
Mid-September.
Mid-September. What's surprised you the most in the book talks you've given, the events, like the reaction to it? What's been the most surprising aspect of what your book has produced here?
So maybe one thing that was, I don't know if it was surprising, is how some people on both sides, and there are more than two sides, but sort of the more pro-Israel, the more Palestinians, could pick from the book what they want to hear without hearing the other side.
Wow.
So
imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. And but in some ways, it tells me that we succeeded in not entirely by any means, but trying to put ourselves in the shoes of both sides. But it's been, I don't know how surprising it's been. But you want to know the most surprising thing that happened, which is a bit of a side anecdote, but for me, it was by far the most surprising thing that happened. So we haven't spoken yet, but I do speak about my father in the book, and he was a Egyptian Jew, but a very pro-Arab nationalist who, unlike other members of his family, was not religious, was pro-Palestinian. They were pro-Israeli after 1948. They were Zionists. He was not. So they were kind of estranged.
Yeah.
And I really never got to know the rest of my family. So I gave a book talk. One of the book talks I gave was at the JCC in Westchester County. The book talk, it was the first one I gave to a Jewish community audience. It went very well. The end of the book talk, when I'm signing books, the last person who comes up to me is this woman, a little bit older than I am, and she says to me, "We've known each other. I've known you your entire life, but we've never met." She was my first cousin, who I never met.
What?
But she'd heard I was giving this talk. She was very nervous to come because she said her father was my father's brother. I never met, or maybe no, I don't know if I ever met him, but I certainly never met his daughter.
Yeah.
And so for me, that thanks to this book, which she told me she found it hard to read, but she thought it was an important read for her. That thanks to this book, I'm now reuniting. I'm going to meet all of them next month. We're going to family that I've never seen. So you asked me the most surprising thing that came out of the book. It was that. Yeah. Least surprising, of course, was the number of people who came up to me and said, "You can't say the two-state solution is dead because you're killing all hope." That was not surprising. I knew I would hear that.
Right.
And my answer to them is, I know you want to cling to hope, and we all do. Uh-huh. But do you think that by saying two states, you're giving hope to the people who really matter, the Israelis and the Palestinians? They're the least likely to believe what you're saying because they know that it's not happening anytime soon, if ever. Yeah. So you may want to preserve hope for you and wherever capital you live in. But for the people who really need hope, every time they hear somebody say, again, mechanically, two-state solution, it decreases their hope because it proves to them that people are just interested in words and not in changing anything.
Yeah, my conversations with friends I worked with back in the 90s, Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who live in Gaza, they sort of don't care about our debates about two-state, one-state confederation. They just sort of want a better life. And what comes next and all of this, they're more concerned about they see these debates as academic.
Better life, but with dignity and with their political rights also to some extent.
100%. Yeah. Okay. That's it. You mentioned your father. He's a key character in this book and why it's so lyrical and important. Tell us a little bit more about him. And he also introduced you to Yasser Arafat when you were a young man. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
So he was the epitome of the outsider. And maybe that was someone, again, being Jewish in Egypt, being an anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian among the Jewish community in Egypt. So outsider twice already, who moves to the U.S. and is an inveterate critic of anything that has to do with American foreign policy. So that's his point. Even when he's here, he becomes an outsider. Then he moves to France to start a magazine, which is a third worldist revolutionary magazine, which is so outside the norm that he gets expelled from France. As an American journalist, that's, I don't know when the last time or the next time that it happened. Probably never and probably won't happen. But he was so outside the norm that they kicked him out. So he was the eternal outsider who, I inherited some of it. We had a lot of disagreements. But as you say, this was probably my sophomore, junior year in college. We were traveling to Algeria.
So you're about 20, 21 years old or so?
Yeah, maybe a little younger, but around then. And we're having dinner with friends, and all of a sudden, door barges open, you have the security detail that comes in, checks everything, and in walks Arafat, who at that point, was very recognizable, his keffiyeh and everything about him, proceeds to speak over dinner for about an hour or two in Arabic to my father and whoever else was there. I didn't speak a word of Arabic, my brother and sister neither. And at the end of the dinner, he turned to us and he said that he hoped we enjoyed the conversation. We said, sorry, we don't speak a word of Arabic. And then he said in what was then very broken English, his English improved over time, he said, well, next time I promise we'll speak in English. Mm-hmm. And the next time that I saw him was in 1998, I guess, 1998, in the Clinton White House when I'm advising President Clinton. So for him, it must have been something like, couldn't quite figure out how you go from being the son who he associates with sort of pro-Palestinian, anti-American, anti-Israeli, to somebody who's now advising President Clinton. And I think it took him a while to try to adjust. But it is, by the way, why Hussein tried to get to know me, because Arafat had told him, this guy is Simon's son, so try to get to know.
Now, I have to say, a key point in your book that I really took away from, I knew about Arafat, but you actually offer really important, both of you, insights about what motivated him, how he operated, and how people thought in a linear way about him and his decision-making, and as if he or the Palestinians actually had some sort of strategy. And you sort of debunk that, right?
And that I really owe to Hussein, who, by the way, in recent times has said to me, the person who Arafat reminds him most of today, take a guess?
Donald Trump?
Donald Trump.
Really? Because he's like a improv performer in chief, right?
Who can lie and cheat, and it doesn't really matter because there's a meaning behind what his lies that if you know him, you can make sense of. I mean, the trope about Trump, even when he says something that it sounds absurd, in fact, if you know him well enough, you know what he's trying to say. And yes, so there was that. And so he just felt that the two of them actually would get along in some odd way.
So this whole like, don't take Trump
That's exactly
literally, but take him seriously. So there, you heard it here first. Rob Malley told you Donald Trump got his leadership style from Yasser Arafat, right?
I said that, and don't get me into more trouble than I'm already in. But
there you go, MAGA folks. You're gonna like that. You dedicate the book to your mother. You don't talk about her. Your mother.
No, and I actually regret that. I wish
you
I
hint about differences she has with your views. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So her background,
Yeah.
Jewish woman from the Bronx, her side is Ashkenazi. I still haven't figured out quite, even though I asked her, she's now 93 or 4, why she got involved in Middle East politics. She met some Algerians when she was in Paris, and then she volunteered for the FLN, the Algerian Liberation Front during the War of Independence against France. But unbeknownst, I mean, she didn't know my father at the time, and then they met through those circles. But sort of odd that she had volunteered for the FLN. It's not something that most Americans, Jewish Americans, would do. I think over time, I think she's just become much more, how could I put it? Much more, her views are much closer to my father's now than they were when my father was alive. And they used to, and she's become, in my view, she would reject this by sort of reflexively.
We're going to make sure she listens to this, Rob.
I don't know. I have to be very careful. She can be, she's wonderful, but she can be get quite angry. And I think she has become more reflexively anti-American, anything having to do with the U.S., anything having to, so.
Yeah.
Anything I say, which, as you say, I'm very critical of the U.S., but it's not, I don't think that it's a dogmatic view that the U.S. is always evil. And, but so I think she would disagree with anything that I would consider to be nuanced, and she might consider to be too much of a, on the one hand, on the other hand. I think she believes that since I've been to law school, I've developed too much of this. Well, I could see both sides. And so I see her criticism, and that's not who she is today. Whether she was like that in the past, I don't know. But today it's firmer and perhaps, let me put it that way, firmer in her beliefs.
So you come from pretty solid leftist, anti-imperialist stuff.
Definitely.
That's the background, the milieu.
Yeah.
How did you change over time?
So I do think working in government, and we both started more or less at the same time, and I keep saying it to my parents, it's just the caricature of how the U.S. makes decisions. It doesn't, even decisions I disagree with.
Yeah.
It's not like this grand conspiracy. If only, right? If only the U.S. were that astute,
right,
that adept at having this grand design. I think a lot of it is out of, some of it is out of that. A lot of it is out of misunderstanding, lack of empathy, lack of comprehension of local realities. Not always out of evil design. Sometimes, clearly. And I think you mentioned Mark Lynch. I think his book does a very good job of trying to relate individual decision-making on the American side in a vast structure that itself may be more designed to dominate the Middle East. It doesn't mean that every individual decision is motivated by that. And, I also compare what the U.S. does to what other countries do. And so I'm not sure that other countries have more benevolent or great powers have more benevolent designs. And one thing I would say to my parents is, and I could be very critical of the U.S. As you say, my book is extremely critical. But I do think that at least there's some voices in administration that try to say, well, what about human rights? What about humanitarian?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that in the Kremlin they have those discussions. That's not to excuse the U.S. I think the U.S. has done enormous harm to the world. And I chafe when people say, well, the U.S. is a force for good. And it's a force for good sometimes. It's not a force for good in many other occasions. But I think that having been inside the belly of the beast, as I describe it in the book, I think I have maybe a more nuanced approach. And again, the kind of nuance that my mother may find infuriating at times.
But in terms of outcome, here, let me give you true or false.
Yeah.
America has done more harm than good in the Middle East over the last 40 years. True or false?
Probably true.
But you would say it's a complicated case. It's not by design.
Not always by design, but they're reflexes, they're biases, they're structures. They're structures that are hard to shift. Again, I think Mark Lynch does a very good job of showing the inertia and the power of structures that transcend what, as he says, Obama was motivated by some very generous views, but was he able to translate them? And in the end, did he perpetuate modes of policy modes that have continued, and particularly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, when people tell me what would have happened if the U.S. hadn't been involved in Israeli-Palestinian affairs, the truth is I don't know. But if you look at where we were in 1993 and you compare to where we were in 2023 pre-October 7th,
yeah,
everything was worse. I mean, you just said it earlier, more checkpoints. Everything was worse. So what good did the U.S. do? Maybe it prevented an even worse outcome. But that's a pretty sad commentary on the superpower with all the leverage it had over Israelis and Palestinians, that the best it could do is avoid something worse, but wasn't able to prevent a real deterioration of the situation.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you something that you didn't really mention in the book, but it's my hobby horse, and because I worked for NDI on the ground with Palestinians. And at that time, in 96 to 98, you and I, and we'll get to when we met and who we all knew and talk a little bit about that. I hope you're okay with that.
Of course.
I had this perception because I was out there after Jimmy Carter had monitored the elections. I was with NDI, that the voice of the Palestinian peoples were never really part of the Oslo process. And I raised this with Dennis Ross, who was on the podcast a few months ago, and I do think it was a structural flaw. And it's a convoluted question I'm asking here, but how do you bring that voice in to give it meaning and give the process legitimacy without further complicating what you already portray with Hussein, a very complicated negotiation set of issues between Israelis and Palestinians? You understand the impulse is like, I think a deficiency, and it's certainly been deficiency in Egypt-Israel peacemaking. It was a peace with a dictatorship with Sadat. Same thing with Jordan as well, that the Abraham Accords really didn't have a public component of it. For the next phase, when I think about what's next, I actually think it's terribly important to try to bring into the circle the voice and the concerns of Palestinian people, but how you balance that with actually getting somewhere. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So first comment I'm making, it relates to something you were saying earlier. I do think that it's not just that the U.S. didn't bring in Palestinian voices. I think the U.S., and it's understandable, was much less familiar with Palestinians, Palestinian narrative, Palestinian experience.
Yeah.
You spoke about my first encounter with any Israeli or any Palestinian was with Arafat.
Right.
I don't think Dennis Rouse or my good friend Aaron Miller or others would say the same. They had a very different starting point, but I think the vast majority of people in the Clinton and other administrations, their background was much more familiar with Israel and Judaism. And I'm not in favor of quotas in government, but I do think that it's interesting to note that there were very few people on the team who had that, and I don't even count myself because I had not.
Yes. So the last podcast we had was with Ted Kattouf.
Okay.
I didn't even realize that he's Palestinian.
Yeah.
Right. And he talks about his background and his connectivity there. Yeah.
Right, that's a fair point.
Yeah.
And so you're right that you need to bring those voices in. I think, and it's something that Hussein and I write about, when you're a negotiator, when you're a diplomat, or even Hussein, you look for shortcuts.
Yeah.
And the shortcut is not to include all these voices, this cacophony of voices that are going to raise issues that you don't really want to hear. But excluding them obviously didn't work. And as you say, in particular on the Palestinian side, and in particular, the U.S. does have this habit, I don't know that it's peculiar to the U.S., to bring in, to the extent they're going to bring in Palestinians, as Palestinians they feel comfortable with. They look like us. They talk like us. They were educated in similar institutions. They dress like us. So you're not going to have refugees that much. You're not going to have Islamists. But that's by dealing with the slice of Palestinians who you're comfortable with, you're guaranteeing that you're not going to deal with those you're uncomfortable with. And they happen to have, unfortunately or fortunately, whoever, depending on where you sit, more power, certainly more disruptive power.
Yeah.
So I do think we need those voices. We need to listen, even if they're going to say things that seem to be complicating the process. Again, as we write, Hussein and I were of the view for the longest time, let's not deal with history. Let's not deal with, the grievances of the past. We have enough complication just dealing with trying to find a solution today. The problem is that the problems of today are inherited from the past and they're rooted in the past. And so I think we both reached the conclusion that what we thought was making things easier was making things irrelevant.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, and I mentioned this because I don't know if you know this. I think you know this, but I worked for Stan Greenberg for a couple of years after we worked at the White House together. I worked for you. And we were doing polling for a number of different leaders, including Ehud Barak.
Yeah.
And the summer of the Camp David attempt to get peace that you write about, and you've written about several times, but you have a fresh take on it with Hussein this time. Yeah. We were doing nightly polling of Israeli public opinion, testing different things that Barack was never really clear, as you make clear in the
Mhm.
book, what his endpoint was. But he was gauging where public sentiment was at.
Yeah.
Because he had to.
Yeah.
He had a system where he had to. Arafat didn't, right? He basically.
Well, that's debatable.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, he faced a lot of opposition from different methods and means, but there wasn't much of an impulse, I think, there.
Yeah.
To at least when I talk to my friends in Palestine, they feel like unheard by many of the Palestinian Authority. PLO
today, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And I just raised that as a point of the fodder for what we need to talk about for the next phase.
I think it goes to a very important point, which is we are sensitive, almost hypersensitive to Israeli politics, right? Barack would tell Clinton, I'm not sure you remember this, I can't do this because of my right wing. I have to allow settlement construction because if I alienate the settler community, then when I'm going to need them for a peace deal, they won't be there. So he was like, every step he took, understandably, was guided by his view of domestic politics, which we accepted, internalized, sometimes reinforced. When it came to the Palestinians, we viewed all that as excuses. Arafat is the authoritarian. He's autocratic. He could get anything through. Whenever he raises his domestic problems, both Barack and we would say, forget it. Those are just excuses. Of course, you get it by.
Right.
They have their own form of politics. As we say, Arafat was probably the most democratic of autocratic leaders because he didn't have any institutions. He didn't have any real power. I mean, what was he? What held him where he was? He had only enemies in the region. If he wasn't in tune with what he felt was his public opinion, he was finished.
Yeah.
So that was his instrument. And so, yes, it did mean that he would do things that he felt were essential to maintain his legitimacy and his credibility, all the things that Barack completely dismissed, even though he was master of taking his own politics into account. And I think as Americans, I mean, you remember Al Gore and others would say, all we need is sort of, he wouldn't say this, but tough security to get rid of the dissidents, the Islamists and others.
Yeah.
Yes, Palestinians have their own politics. Even autocrats have politics.
One more question on the Palestine thing before we talk about and close out on your book and talk about your career. Where do you see the role these days and throughout sort of more recent history, the role of regional states? And I wonder, and let me frame my question in this sort of way, whether there's been missed opportunities, particularly later in Biden and later in the Obama administration and the Biden administration, to actually channeled this impulse that we saw this year alone of the symbolic recognition of a state of Palestine. And I know that you mentioned Arafat had no friends in the region and things like this, but did we miss an opportunity? Have we missed an opportunity to try to build a coalition in the region in favor of a two-state solution? And because you write about this from time to time, about this impulse, but when I read this book and I think, well, there's a basic power imbalance between Israel and Palestinians. You know this as well. Wouldn't it have been wiser from a statecraft standpoint to actually assemble all of the countries, especially after October 7th? I made this argument privately in some of my writings here at MEI, that it would have been a more strategic case to say, look, a practical pathway, not a symbolic pathway to a two-state solution, to start a different conversation in the region, inside of Israel, that says the region would welcome you. If there's some sort of pathway. And I don't see Trump doing that right now.
I don't know post-October 7th. Let's even focusing before you're absolutely right. It's more than a missed opportunity. I think it's a missed dimension. We completely, and we do write in the book, while tomorrow's yesterday, if you go back to 1948 and after, this was not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was an Israeli-Arab conflict, and the Palestinians, leaderless, completely manipulated by Arabs, the Arabs were the ones who were in some ways speaking for the Palestinians.
Yeah.
We're not quite there again today, but I think it was a genuine and absolute mistake. And I think our colleagues would recognize it, certainly during the Clinton years and at Camp David, to act as if Palestinians could negotiate with Israelis alone. Now, that suited Israeli interests because the Palestinians were weak at the time.
Right.
And so why not we get a better deal? And I remember Barack telling Clinton, don't involve other Arab countries. Because then, they're going to side with the Palestinians. But that weakness of the Palestinians meant that they also couldn't make decisions, and Arafat would say it. And again, at the time, I think the Clinton team and Barack saw it as an excuse, but he would say, I cannot divide Jerusalem alone. I cannot decide of the fate of Jerusalem alone. I need Arabs to back me up because Jerusalem is more than a Palestinian cause. It's an Arab cause.
Yeah.
And we may be back now for unfortunate circumstances because the Palestinians are so weak, leaderless, divided, unable, what do they have to offer to the Israelis? So the Arab world is going to have to, if they are prepared to step up. They've done it in the past, the Arab Peace Initiative, you're well aware of. So they've done things in the past where they signaled their willingness to, try to work on behalf of the Palestinians to some extent. Now, I'm very skeptical of the Arab governments and Arab leaders, how much they really care, and how much they'll do. But if this is going to move now, the Arab world is going to have to step up. And in particular, if President Trump is interested in expanding the Abraham Accords, it does give countries, in particular like Saudi Arabia, an opportunity, if they want to press for advances on the Palestinian front. It didn't happen really in the first iteration of the Abraham Accords. Maybe now, because the Palestinians are in the state of disrepair that they're in, and because Arab governments have seen that what happens, they've known it, but they've seen it vividly since October 7th, that what happens in Israel-Palestine obviously affects their own politics and their public opinion. Now would be the time, at a minimum, to bring them in, and for them to try to shoulder greater responsibility to advance Palestinian aspirations. We'll have to see whether it happens. We didn't talk about Trump, and I don't know that we need to talk too much, but the transactional nature of his politics
could make it.
The transactional nature, no, I was going to say something more negative. The transactional nature of some of the Gulf Arab politics means that they may settle for things that pay lip service to the Palestinian cause, but really don't advance it.
So another true or false question. Okay. September 2023, Israel-Saudi normalization could have occurred pre-October 7th. It was close. People were working on it in the Biden administration. True or false? You think it could have happened?
I think it could have happened, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I disagree.
Okay.
I don't think it was even close.
I'm not saying, so whether it was, you don't think it was even conceivable?
I don't think it was in the cards, because a lot of what the Saudis were demanding of the Biden administration at the time was not politically possible.
Unrelated to the Palestinians or having to do with the Palestinians?
Unrelated to the Palestinians.
Okay, because security deal. Yeah, no, you may be right. You may be right about that. I was focusing more on the Palestinian front, but
side. You think they would have swapped?
I think at the time, I do think the Saudi price has gone up significantly
because of the war, 2 years of war.
But yes, and you may well be right that it was not achievable even before. I know members of the Biden administration think that before October 7th it was very achievable. They even think it was achievable after October 7th, where the real delusion occurs.
I agree. I had this discussion as well, and I said, you know what this is like? This is going to sound crazy, but this is like TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys are going out negotiating something that you don't have a political pathway or policy pathway. And even the Saudis agree. I remember in dialogues that we were having at MPI with Saudi leaders in 2024, they said this could happen before the elections. This is like in the spring of 2024.
Yeah.
I was like, are you kidding? Who's the point person for marshaling this? They said Lindsey Graham. I said, there you go. It's not going to go anywhere because there's nobody that is managing this inside of the U.S. politics.
So I'm putting myself back in that mode. And my big hesitation at the time was thinking, yes, Lindsey Graham is saying it, but Donald Trump will not want a deal. So I'm going to revise my answer. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, no, I raised these two questions, the Palestinian people, but also the regional dimension, in part because your book, again, tells an important story, lessons learned from front lines, you and Hussein, as you see it. But I think these are two important ingredients, no matter what formulation we look for. You're going to need to actually, for the regional dimension, if you want to have an equilibrium, some sort of power, a realpolitik balance there, you're going to need some sort of unity between Palestinians and Arab neighbors who now are more or less singing from the same sheet of music, more or less, right? There's always divisions between, but
today it's a different division, UAE, Saudi Arabia, but yes.
But more or less, if you had strong, which we don't have, in my view, a strong sort of diplomatic, proactive diplomacy on this front. And then the missing component is the Palestinian people itself. Yeah. And those two components actually are quite sometimes incompatible, because some of the regional actors really would prefer to have dictators or strong men and things like this. And
I mean, of course, this brings us to another issue, which we discuss a bit in the book, and which is the whole attitude towards Palestinian elections, Palestinian politics, where we, the U.S., but others as well, were very open to an inclusive Palestinian politics as long as it didn't yield a result that we didn't like. And that's just not, I mean, you've worked at and elsewhere. I mean, it just doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't work that way. So close out on the book, everybody. Even if you're inclined not to like Rob Malley and his co-author or disagree with his views, tomorrow is yesterday. Read it, because it'll provide you with new insights and new openings and ways of thinking about things. I want to spend a few minutes taking a look back on your career.
Okay.
Where do we meet? You remember? I'm going to quiz you. What year?
The year, I don't know. It wasn't
1999.
Okay.
Summer of 1999. Who did we work with?
Bruce Rydell,
And
Sandy Berger,
and
Kathy Cooper. Oh,
Ken
Ken Pollock.
Ken Pollock,
Of course.
Kathy Cooper, Gina Abercrombie Winstanley,
Donald Camp.
Donald Camp. People
Yeah.
forget this. We were in the Near East, South Asia.
It was half a dozen people, which then blossomed to, 3-4 times that
Well,
number?
you tell me, because back then in the late 90s, it was 7 people.
But also covering South Asia.
Yeah, from
Yeah.
India.
Yeah, so not
to
minor.
Morocco.
Right.
Yeah, and you were sort of, as you write in the book, part of the peace team and working with Dennis Ross and Aaron Miller, who I think were housed at the State Department.
Yep.
You mentioned Kathy Cooper. I miss her so much. I mean,
Yeah.
she passed away years ago. It used to be my date to go to classical music concerts, and she and her husband Bill, who also passed away, were just these solid people. People think of Washington D.C. as all of these political folks, and these people served in government, but in quiet ways, and just had decent lives and were really good Americans. And miss her very, very, very much. What I want to ask you, sort of in your long career on U.S. foreign policy, the first big question, it's a hard question to ask somebody who spent close to more than a quarter century in several administrations. When you look back on your storied career, what's your biggest success story? What's your biggest accomplishment?
So unfortunately, it's not even a close call, right? Because I worked on Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Syrian, Israeli-Syrian, Syrian-Russian during the Syrian Civil War, and Iran. And of course, Iran was a success, the JCPOA, which was a success that may be ephemeral, but it was a success. And so that, for me, the greatest satisfaction in terms of just achievement was that. The other achievements were, and for people who want to go into government, I think it's always important to think of, is events where you could see the human dimension of what you've achieved. So getting hostages out, getting a political prisoner out from Egypt, or getting the Americans out of Iran, or getting Kurds who were being threatened by Saddam Hussein. That was one of the first things I did, helped in the Clinton administration. Those, because you could see the human result of what you did,
right,
are in some ways the most rewarding. But politically, strategically, I thought the JCPOA, of course, little did I know that only a few years later it would be a thing of the past. But that was the one negotiation where I felt a president put all of his cards, to use an expression that President Trump would like, all of his cards on the table, and said, this is in a core national security interest, in a way that peace between Israelis and Palestinians never was for the presidents I served. But for President Obama, getting a deal with Iran was absolutely crucial. And so he's prepared to overcome objections from, obviously, Israel, from the Gulf, from Republicans, also from his own party. And that showed me that when a president really wants to get something done, he can, or they can, or she can, but they need to be prepared to pay the political and regional price. Yeah,
we'll talk a little bit about that. I forgot to ask you one other question. How did you get into this line of work? How did you make that leap? And what was the spark? What inspired you? Because you basically had lefty parents who were like anti-imperialist, and then you're in the belly of the beast, and your dad's uneasy with you working at the White House. But how did you? What was the spark?
So it's interesting. So 2 things happened. First, I was very close to George Stephanopoulos because we'd gone to Oxford together, and he, of course, was one of President Clinton's key advisors. So when I moved to Washington, I'd clerked here, and then I was looking for a job. I thought, I'm never going to have an opportunity like this. So I worked, he helped, and I got a job in the Department of Education. I had a legal degree, and so I was in the Civil Rights Office of the Department of Education. I remember vividly what happened. I was a bit frustrated there, and I watched. There was they announced the Oslo agreement in 1993,
right?
And George got me invited to be a spectator on the lawn, and I thought, this is what I want. I care about education. I care about civil rights.
Yeah.
My God, my heart is in this. So I quit the Department of Education, tried to find my way, applied to a number of fellowships, and got a Council on Foreign Relations fellowship to work in the administration. My first knock on the door was Martin Indyk. He was then the senior director for Near East Affairs, or NINA, I forget what it was called.
Right.
Didn't work out. I think at the time our politics were very distant. They got a little bit closer over time, but I'm not sure that's why he didn't take me, even though I was free labor.
Yeah.
And then Mort Halperin, who was the senior director in the Office of Democracy.
Okay, I didn't know.
And he was somebody they had not given any staff to. So all of his staff were people he could just grab from fellowships.
Okay.
Kurt Campbell was one. So my first office mate was Kurt Campbell.
Wow.
People who know, he then became Asia czar under President
And
Biden.
Secretary of State.
And Deputy Secretary of State, of course. And so that was my first introduction in '94 to the White House. And then, so it was supposed to be for 1 year, and then I got to know people there, and they extended me until they put me on staff. So I got the bug. Again, as I say in the book, it's a trade-off, and you know this as well. When you're in government, you don't make policy. I'm not elected to anything.
Yeah.
And so you have to swallow quite a few things that you don't agree with, but you feel like you're where the decisions are being made. And it's always a question which we could get into about at what point are those decisions so incompatible with your own set of moral values that you decide to quit.
Have you ever thought of quitting when you were in these positions?
There were a few times when I felt uncomfortable with what the administration was doing. We could mention a few of them.
Please do. Well, give me
the administration's policy towards Iraq. I remember there was one moment. I wish I could remember exactly when it was.
Is that your Obama administration?
No, this was under Clinton.
Oh, Clinton.
Where there was the
Iraq Liberation Act.
No, there was talk of bombing Iraqi sites because Saddam Hussein was preventing the access by U.S. inspectors. Kofi Annan was negotiating a deal. I wish I could remember the year. It was in the late 90s. And some members of the White House were saying, we don't want this deal. So we want to bomb Iraq. And it was a small issue when I think about it, perhaps in hindsight. I don't know how small it was for some Iraqis. But I was like, if we're going to stymie Kofi Annan's efforts because we want to bomb Iraq, but in the end, that worked out. So there was no other time, President Obama's policy towards Yemen is one that I found extremely troubling.
About that a little bit.
But that was in the middle of the negotiations with Iran, and I thought that was the bigger strategic prize. Again, that's not something that I think the Yemenis who suffered from the Saudi offensive would agree with, and maybe that was a pretty cynical call, but I felt that working towards the Iran deal was critical enough. So, and then, of course, I was out of the Biden administration for reasons having to do with a investigation about which I know nothing. Security clearance.
It's a mystery to you.
It's a mystery, but it got closed. But had I been in the administration post-October 7th, I would like to think that would have pushed me over the edge, and I would have resigned. You never know until you're there, but I really hope that I would have done that.
I think it's this question of whether staying in and you can move things by millimeters or centimeters and make...
Yeah, and also the emotional cost of breaking with people who brought you in and all that. But again, I think for me, the Biden administration's policy post-October 7th was so, on a fundamental moral issue, was so at odds with what I believe in that I don't know how
you could have stayed. Yeah. What's your biggest regret from your time in service, in public service? The thing that you fell short in? Is it the reason why you wrote this book? Is it was it on the Israel-Palestine front, or?
I mean, there are a number of things that I wish I'd spoken out more, whether it was at the time of Camp David to say, here's what the mistakes that we're making, or in the Obama administration, as you know, there was a debate about whether the administration would push for a resolution at the Security Council that would lay out the parameters for a peace deal. I wish I'd pushed harder. I wouldn't have succeeded. So those are regrets about sort of why didn't I speak out, even though it wouldn't have had a success.
Yeah.
I probably should never have accepted the job of special envoy to Iran. So if you want me to think, and we could talk about why. But,
yeah, let's get into that. Why? Why?
The two people who recommended, two of the people who told me not to take it were my mother, that won't surprise you, and my wife. So the two women I really should listen to more.
Yes, yeah.
Because, for whatever reason, I mean, my mother, interestingly, and this, again, not surprising given what I said, her feeling was the reason they're bringing you in is because they want to have sort of a more left-wing or progressive cover to insulate themselves from criticism, even though they don't have any intention of doing anything particularly forward-leaning.
Do you agree with her assessment now, when you look back at 2020 hindsight, that they weren't that committed to it?
Well, I definitely think they weren't that committed. I don't think that's why they brought me in. I knew them. They thought I knew the file.
Yeah.
And, they were prepared to take quite a bit of heat by bringing me in, as you know.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
I'm not sure that they don't regret it as well. But I think what became clear to me, even after a few days or weeks, was that the president, and he has the right to feel that way, did not feel like getting back into the deal was his priority.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think he maybe thought, you know what? I'm not really in favor of maximum pressure campaign. I denounced it. I said we should restore some of the humanitarian channels. But once you're in office, he and I think some of the members of the White House, the National Security Council were like, no, we have this extra leverage. Why not use it? Why let it go to waste? So let's demand a better deal from the Iranians using the fact that we now have the maximum pressure sanctions that we haven't lifted.
Yeah.
And I might have concluded as early as then that this was not going to work because you really, as I said earlier, on a file like Iran, which is so toxic,
Yes.
maybe more toxic than Israel-Palestine. Who knows? It's
it
debatable.
Yeah, yeah.
If you don't have the political will to take those hits, if you're going to always be looking behind your shoulder and consulting with, at the time it was Bob Menendez, Senator Menendez, to know whether you could move forward, you're not going to move forward. And maybe I should have concluded that and not have taken the job, but
So where do slogans like longer and stronger come up from? Because it seems to me that, again, on a complicated issue like Iran, and I've written a lot about this, less so at Middle East Institute, at a publication I used to run called The Liberal Patriot, where I feel like whatever angle you have, whether you're from the right or the left, our policy outcomes on Iran have been suboptimal, and that
charitable.
One good thing we've been really great at in America is dividing ourselves over sort of what the end state might be, and that we actually don't end up having strategic debates. We end up having these tribal debates where we divide ourselves, and then Iran sees these divisions and tries to exploit them. So whether it's JCPOA 2015, which I supported, but thought it was a very thin sliver of domestic political support for factors that were beyond your control, right? Or Trump pulling out of it in 2018. But my bigger picture it's easy at a think tank to do this, by the way, and sitting on the sidelines from the cheap seats to say, well, this is not great because whether you're Republican or Democrat, because I actually think the way Obama, and you were part of the Obama team, sold the JCPOA, it was highly partisan, right? And I remember him going to senators like Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, essentially saying, if you don't vote for this deal, this means war, right? And a lot of people were offended by that sort of dialogue, but I think that was my broader analysis was born out of how Republicans were posturing on this and how Bibi and others were trying to divide. So understand my point is that it's hard to get big wins in the world without some sort of vital center that's rebuilt, but we're tearing ourselves apart on all of these issues, whether it's Israel, Palestine, or Iran. Do you agree or disagree with that?
So I think you and I probably have a slight disagreement on what the vital center and, what it looks like and what it should be and whether it's worth, but I do, and even on the Iran file, I do think there's some very legitimate disagreements, right? About people who believe in regime change. Clearly they would be against the JCPOA. And so I think they're legitimate arguments. I just think sometimes those arguments are couched in ways that completely discredit the other side. I mean, and of course, since I was the target of a delegitimization campaign, that we are appeasers and that anyone who wants to do a deal with Iran is an ally of the mullah, and I've been accused of all of that. I do think when it becomes polarized to that extent, where you can't move without being viewed as a traitor, then yes, you can't do anything. And I do think it's become very hard, as you say, to do anything that is bold, because anything that's bold by definition is controversial.
Yeah.
And it does. I mean, I'm not in favor of monarchy, but it does put the U.S. at a real disadvantage. I've seen this more than one occasion in any negotiation with a party whose leadership it knows it's going to be there for decades.
Right.
When they know that the U.S. is whoever's in power is just transient, and the next administration is going to renege on what the prior one did. So I think we have a real problem. Again, I don't know what the answer is. I'm not in favor of a mushy middle as the answer.
Right.
I wish that Democrats could be as assertive as Republicans are. I mean, many people have said this, but there is something in the Trump method, which is of saying, you know what, I believe I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and try to stop me if you can, and not be so afraid of your shadow and not so afraid of the criticism by the other side. I think Democrats, what I've called in some things that I've written, sort of their throat clearing, which is before taking a bold position, they'll concede the arguments of their opponents.
Yeah.
So you asked about longer, stronger when it comes to Iran. The number of Democrats who post-Obama were saying, you know what, we have to concede the point that the JCPOA is deeply flawed, that we should negotiate a longer, stronger deal. You say that, and then you say, but for now, the JCPOA is the best we can get. You've already lost the debate.
Yeah.
If you conceded the arguments of your opponents, you're then operating on their territory, on their side of the turf. So I do think Democrats on a number of these foreign policy issues, and it may be sort of the legacy of the years after President Carter, when Democrats said, never again are we going to be accused of being too soft. So if somebody's going to accuse us of being soft on Iran, we're going to have to be hard if we're going to be soft on whatever issue. So I do think that there's a reluctance on the side of Democrats, or there had been reluctance to take strong positions when it has to do with diplomacy and issuing military solutions for diplomatic ones.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be more self-confidence and a willingness to say, you know what, we're going to buck Republican opposition and maybe even some opposition in our own party if we believe it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think, for years, and when I first started out at the Center for American Progress in the 2000s, and I wrote some things on Iraq, and I faced some opposition. Basically, the sort of ideas we put out there, President Obama ultimately used in his campaign, and others did as well.
That's a very good example.
But the first reaction to this was, well, this is too radical and it's too piercing. And there was this, what I thought was this self-imposed national security deficit disorder, post-Vietnam, all of the memes and things like this. Now, what I wrestle with that personally as well is that if we are constantly from the left and then the right going after each other and tearing each other apart, and I'm not an advocate for the soft, mushy middle. Ultimately, we're eroding any sort of sense of national consensus or purpose on any of these big questions. And, and that's what makes it. And then the big debate we have today, I think, just as Americans, is Trump is in his own category, right? He like China is one of the biggest questions where he's shifted in a big way that people aren't even debating, I think, on China. A few people are, but we don't have a sense of national purpose if we're constantly on Israel, Palestine, Iran, and other things debating each other.
I don't have a good answer because I was very uncomfortable in the first Trump administration when Republican anti-Trumpers and Democrats would come together and say, let's oppose Trump. And so if he reached out to Kim Jong-un or he spoke of anything that was viewed as breaking the norm, there was this consensus of what I would, it's not the mushy middle, but it is the neocon, anti-Trump, never Trumpers, and some of the Democrats. And Mark Lynch and I wrote a piece saying, beware of the reflexive anti-Trump instinct that gravitates towards what you consider to be the middle. Yeah. But I take your point that it's very hard to see why any country would want to deal with us and deal with us seriously if there's a zigzag where one day as a Democrat you do one thing, then as a Republican. Why would anyone trust any American signature? So I think it's a very serious issue. I don't have a good answer because I wouldn't say that Democrats would then concede to follow the Republicans' lead, but who knows? Maybe our politics does have a way of shifting. Maybe we'll move away from what is today about as polarized as certainly in my lifetime I can remember. Your lifetime is shorter, so yours too.
Yeah. So maybe two more Middle East questions, and we'll get to close out really soon. Syria. Yeah. You don't talk much about Syria, but I've been thinking about Syria because we at the Middle East Institute, we hosted Ahmed Ashara in September. We had a wonderful seminar just yesterday here at MEI about where things have gone. You were in the White House at a time when Sandy Berger was a dear mentor of ours. And I think he probably had the same conversations he had with me in the last year of his life. And I can't believe it's been 10 years since he passed away. But his dying sort of battle, I don't know if you remember this, was he thought you guys were wrong on Syria. And I don't want to, but he was operating, I thought, with a bit of an outdated paradigm. He was looking at Syria through the lens of the Kosovo, Bosnia wars and things like this. But I remember he even persuaded Hillary Clinton as a candidate to adopt the no-fly zones in the fall of 2015. When you look back on Syria, I've written this, and I think we'll disagree on this. I see the Iraq War in 2003 is where America really lost its mind. We lost our sense of, but I think on Syria over a decade plus, we lost our soul, meaning we lost the ability to see the suffering of the Syrian people in the way that I think your book with Hussein beautifully uplifts the Palestinian plight. And some people have written about this, Syrians certainly. But at that time, when you were sitting at the White House on Syria, when you look back on that period, and it's a very sort of complicated period. How do you reflect?
So first I'd say, I know you've spoken to a lot of people who know me. I don't know what some would say, but I don't view myself as having rigid, firm positions. So on Syria, I'm not sure. I ask myself, but and it's interesting that you talk about sort of the prism through which you view things. Mm-hmm. in the middle of the Obama administration, I asked Samantha Power, who was then our ambassador to the UN, I said, let's get together because we agreed on a lot of things. On Syria, we're at loggerheads. I was more of the view, which, Phil Gordon and a few others, we felt that intervening in the civil war was simply going to exacerbate it. We're not going to prevail, or we would not be prepared to do what it would take to prevail. So we'd just perpetuate the conflict, intensify it. We could go through all the bad effects that we thought. She thought we should throw in our lot with the opposition and intervene militarily. And so I said, I want to understand why we disagree, where we agree on so much else. And to me, I'm not sure she would agree. What it came down to is that I looked at it through the prism of the experiences that I shared, which was the war in Iraq. I admit it.
Interesting.
And a lot of my view, and Vietnam, which from the eyes of my parents more than my own, that American military intervention has a very, very sorry record. You could add Libya to the list. Phil Gordon has written a wonderful book that talks about the failures of regime change throughout the Middle East. And she looked at it through Kosovo, where it had worked, and Bosnia where it had worked, and Rwanda, where she's still...
Like Sandy was doing, I think,
And I just think it's just interesting how one's experience really informs how one views a situation. And as I was almost going to write a piece when I left the Obama administration saying how, interestingly, people could look at what happened during the Civil War, not recently, but say until the end of the Obama administration, people who thought that the U.S. shouldn't have intervened would come out and say, I was right, because look, the opposition is radicalized. Russia and Iran have intervened. Had we intervened, we wouldn't have been able to topple the regime because Russia and Iran were there. It might have been an escalatory dynamic. And so we would have felt validated in our view, and the other view would have felt validated by saying, you see, by not intervening, the opposition became more radical, more Islamist, and we left all of the room for Russia and Iran. So I still remain skeptical, again, for reasons that Phil Gordon has done a better job, certainly than I've done in my writing, to explain why intervening. I don't think that we would have toppled Bashar al-Assad. I think at that point, Russia, Hezbollah, let's not forget, it's not, Ahmed Ashar has done something remarkable, but he didn't have a strong Russia, a strong Iran, a strong Hezbollah who were, that's why he didn't succeed until more recently. So, and what Obama would often say, and I don't think that his critics had a good answer within the cabinet, because this would come up all the time.
Yeah.
And I think Obama was aware of the fact that...
Because Ash Carter and others, like senior members of his cabinet...
Not so much Ash Carter, but certainly John Kerry at times, Samantha Power certainly, at times others, they would argue for a more robust military stance. And he would say, okay, I take that stance. And then Assad is still, like we bomb after the Red Line or whatever, although I was not there at the time.
Right.
We bomb, and then he's still standing. Or we do no-fly zone, and he's still standing. And then what? And don't tell me at what point you'd say, oh, it's enough. We've done enough. Mm-hmm. And even though we're going to be viewed as weaker because we've intervened and we haven't achieved anything, and Assad will appear stronger because he resisted American intervention, and Russia will double down. Again, at the time, Russia could double down. It can't anymore, and Hezbollah and Iran could.
Yeah.
And I think he was torn because he hated when he would read that he was abandoning the Syrians. So I had a number of conversations with him, and others did too, where he struggled with it. But I think at the end of the day, he just felt
that was his judgment.
I don't want, and he didn't think that this could be a short intervention. If it was short, it would fail, and if it was long, he'd be dragged into another war. And again, I admit my bias, and my bias is one in which I've rarely seen American military intervention lead to better results. So I admit that. Do I think that provided a good answer for Syrians? No. And I've also raised the question, did we choose the worst of all worlds by supporting the armed opposition in ways that guaranteed a perpetuation of the conflict, but also guaranteed that they wouldn't prevail?
Yeah. No, and again, invoking Sandy, his concern was also geopolitical. He thought that the plays that Russia was starting to run around the world and invading Crimea and in other places, that they were starting to test run some things inside of Syria, which you see what's playing out over the last 2-3 years in Ukraine. And I think there was some wisdom in it, but you're right in terms of the costs and the interventions.
And how far, would it ever have mattered as much to us as it did to Hezbollah, to Iran, and they were prepared to put boots on the ground? Again, I want to say that there's some things I feel very strongly about. I do think leaving the JCPOA was a big mistake. Yeah. On Syria, I can't say that I feel that strongly. Nothing I've seen has fundamentally changed my views. I think the fact that Shara HTS prevailed is one thing, but it's very different from saying, therefore, they could have prevailed in the past. I think they prevailed because the situation in Syria, in the region, and globally was very different in 2024 5 than it was in 2015.
Yeah. So we're running out of time.
Okay.
Two last questions.
Yeah.
Back to your book and where things are today, and back to our discussion on politics in the United States. How much do you see Palestine playing a role in the Democratic Party debate in the run-up to 2028? You saw recently former colleague Ben Rhodes's op-ed.
Yeah.
How do you, first question, do you see it as a big role? And then second, do you think it's good politics to try to make this a big platform debate inside the Democratic Party?
So a bigger role than ever before.
Uh-huh.
I think that's sort of uncontentious, right? I mean, when in the past has this issue,
Yeah.
there have been attempts by some and even Bernie Sanders at some point, but I think it is going to be a litmus test for some. It doesn't mean that it's going to prevail, but for some Democrats, what one's position is on conditionality of arms sales, position towards settlements, perhaps even whether you call it a genocide or not, where you take money from AIPAC, all of those are going to become tests, and we're seeing it play out even in lesser than presidential elections.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be a big issue. I never know. I mean, as you know, I now teach, so it's interesting to see the young generation. For them, it's very important. Does that translate into votes in primaries? Does it translate into vote in general election? I don't know yet.
I don't think so. My view is
You may be right. I think, by the way, I'd say it depends. Partly it depends, and if the war really ends and the ceasefire we could talk about, but still, it's much less murderous than it was before the Trump plan.
Yeah.
And if either Netanyahu is no longer prime minister, or if he gets rid of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the politics may become less intensely focused on this.
Yeah.
And so you may be right. I don't know. Maybe it's going to take more cycles for the young people who feel this way to either run for office or be in positions of responsibility.
Yeah.
But I think so. And is it good politics? Listen, I have my own views. I think we need to change our approach to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. So
Sure.
I hope that this becomes a real issue of debate. And when I listen to people like Ro Khanna, Van Hal, and others, I mean, senators who have or members of Congress who have a very strong voice, Bernie Sanders, I think that's healthy because this issue has been for too long swept under the carpet. But I also think another thing, we were speaking earlier about why Samantha Power and I may see differently what were our formative experiences.
Uh-huh.
What's the formative experience of young people today, of people who are college generation? What's going to be in their mind? What's going to be in their line of sight? It's going to be Gaza.
Yeah.
It's going to be the moral catastrophe that was the humanitarian, human, political, strategic catastrophe that was Gaza, the moral catastrophe of the U.S. association with it. I think that's going to play a role in their future. I see this in my students. Of course, there's a slice of students at one university, but I think you see it in the polling, certainly. For them, this is going to be a test of, is our leadership prepared to take a more moral stance, a more ethical stance towards this conflict?
Yeah.
So over time, who knows? I'm old enough to be...
And you're teaching at Yale, right?
That's right.
You were voted the most popular professor, I heard.
I don't know if there's any vote. I don't know if there's any vote.
No, you were rated.
I know who said that.
Yeah.
So I wish I could say that, but I'm having a great time there. I love the students.
People like you. But let me tell you my view on this. Is I actually I hope that there's more of a connectivity between the American people and the Palestinian people on this. What I worry about is a lot of it is oppositional politics, meaning that they know more what they're against as opposed to what they're in favor of, and whether it translates into something that actually uplifts the Palestinian component in U.S. policy in the Middle East. And yes, you need to create space because of what Israel does with the occupation and settlement expansion and things like this. But there's a lot of energy dedicated to what we're against as opposed to what we're in favor of. And I think first, as a political analyst, I'm concerned that it doesn't rise to the level beyond elite politics. That the thing that didn't get Donald Trump reelected wasn't this issue, I don't think. It was immigration and concerns about inflation and things like this. And I think we need...
Well, they may have tamped down enthusiasm among some, but it's not my expertise. So
but on the margins, I think the thing, I'd rather see some of our sort of big thinkers talk about, okay, what are we going to do as a better alternative on immigration and other things, and then also uplift the Palestinian component in our approach to the Middle East, as I was trying to talk about, in terms of before, the questions about regional politics, power, and those dynamics. And what I worry about is that it's a 1% issue. If you look at the polling, yes, attitudes have shifted, but relative to those other issue sets that people truly vote on in most ordinary Americans. It's in an elite bubble. Yes, there's ferment. There's a different discussion. God bless. I'm glad that that's happening. I don't know that it actually does translate into different votes. Like Zoran Mamdani, different voice in New York City, but he's running New York City. He's not sort of calling the shots in the State Department. And it's just a difference of views. I think there's more of an aspirational hope for change there. But nothing actually, I think, it sustains itself unless it actually provides a clear pathway that is in favor of something as opposed to just being against certain policies.
I don't know. That I mean, not necessarily my expertise.
Yeah.
But I do think there's certain attitudes. Like, again, will there be, if Israel continues what it's doing in the West Bank, will people condition military assistance? Will they take different positions at the Security Council? Will they take a different position towards Palestinian elections and Palestinian reconciliation? So I think there are policy issues where, you don't necessarily have to be in favor of a certain vision of what the end state is, because I don't even know what that is. I think some of the elements you put on the table certainly should be part of it. But again, for me, it's a matter of the young people today, the future, I don't know, Tony Blinken, Colin Powell, now, or whoever they are people who are now being
attuned to this,
socialized, and they will come in with a very different mindset, experience, background, knowledge than the preceding generations. And so you may be right that the political translation will take longer because it is not an issue that's going to animate most Americans. They're going to care much more about affordability and about immigration and about other issues. This is not going to be why they vote. But at a minimum, it means that people who take positions that are outside of what used to be the norm, like Zoran Mamdani, can still win. And so you'll have people who take positions that before would have been, completely heretical, and that would have been a reason why they would have been castigated. Maybe now that changes. And so I look at this. I like to say, because I'm no longer young, I have some, I have the scars of having seen and been hopeful in the past and the hope to be disappointed. But also maybe I'm overly cynical. So I think, every generation has its chance. Again, from the vantage point of being where I am, teaching where I do, it does leave me with a slightly more hopeful taste than I would have thought otherwise.
Last set of questions. How does Rob Malley blow off some steam? I heard a story. You're on the plane with Secretary Kerry. He's doing tic-tac-toe. You're reading Camus.
I love reading in French. I don't know that it was Camus. And I know who said that story. I mean, but no, I do love reading in French. I love playing tennis.
I hear you're cool as a cucumber in a negotiating session. You never lose your temper, but you curse in French.
Not just that, but I sort of lose my nerve, which is not good. I mean, I double fault at crucial moments. So,
and you're not as good as other tennis players that you play with, I hear, as well. Wait. Can we get him to curse in French here on the podcast?
No. I'm cursing in my mind, and I know the source of every statement you've made recently.
But you need to be multidimensional. You can be a senior policymaker. You can run think tanks and write books, but you got to have hobbies, right?
Yeah.
What else would you advise the next generation to do that wants to follow in your footsteps? What advice?
First of all, don't follow my footsteps.
Yeah. Don't be the Iran negotiator. Listen to your mom and your wife, right?
Yes. No, I mean, I really feel I don't have to give them that much advice, because one thing they're doing, which I think is great, is they're very curious. They want to travel. They want to learn another language. They want to learn about other cultures. I mean, it's just, I find it endlessly refreshing to see how much they want to learn. I don't know that they have enough years in their life to learn as much as they want to, but it's inspiring. So, I look back at what happened to me when I had to leave the Biden administration, but maybe there's a higher power, because the things that have happened as a result of that is I wasn't there after October 7th. I got to write a book that I care about. Yeah. And I got to be inspired by young Americans and young people from around the world who have an energy and a desire to change things that it's not always easy to come by.
Yeah. So maybe that's one of the bigger lessons, is that life sometimes grabs you by the arm and takes you where you don't expect to go. And
it's not always the worst place.
Yeah. And so, well, Rob, that's all the time we have for this week. Thanks for coming on the program.
Brian.
I appreciate it. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in, and to our colleagues for their work on this episode. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and subscribe to all of our email newsletters for our latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We will see you all in the new year.